Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, from the Bloc versus Bloc congressional negotiations to the movements bringing demands to the negotiating table. Today on the show...
Finally, we're talking about the issue I care about. Protecting baby hyenas that I saw dying from heat stroke on planet Earth while I was waiting for my COVID test. I don't have COVID, for the record.
This was like there was no sound on at the urgent care office, but you were stricken by the imagery.
I was in there for 45 minutes, and I think I just watched the whole thing. Nobody else was watching, but it was really sad. There are all these hyena puppies, and
this is your story about how you were first awakened to the stakes of this crisis. Is that right?
I mean, yeah, I go to sunrise meetings where they're preparing these Green New Deal sit-ins and actions. The organizer at the front of the room, spunky Zoomer kid, probably a Marxist, just says, for too long, the climate movement has focused on polar bears and penguins. But now we are going to tell the stories about real people, real human beings, and what we care about.
And then they're like, Waleed, come tell us about what brought you to this room today.
Yeah, and I'm like, my dad has like 12 parrots at his house, and some of them are from Brazil, and some of them are from South Asia, and these parrots are endangered. They're going to become, they might not exist when I have grandchildren, and it's really sad. And then
if only the movement talked more about protecting parrots, then maybe your dad would have joined.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to Pakistan right after Trump got elected with my dad, my cousins and my aunts and uncles who live in Pakistan were really shocked that Donald Trump won. And part of their shock about this is that, the literacy rate in Pakistan is 59%. So a very large percent of the country does not know how to read, but 97% of the country believes in climate change. And, every house, middle-class Pakistani families, they have these home gadgets outside their house that tell them what the air quality is every day. And the fact that Americans could elect a president who said during his campaign that climate change was a hoax caused by the Chinese is baffling to many people in the third world and the global south. And so the way that people in the real front lines of the climate crisis have to deal with the climate crisis every day through this gadget they have outside their house was just, I had never seen something like that before.
But you were like, look, guys, I don't know what to say about America. I don't work on climate change. I work for Bernie. Then you went to work for AOC. But then you got roped in, I guess, because AOC joins a sit-in for the Green New Deal.
Yeah, and then climate change and the Green New Deal becomes the last 2 years of my life.
Really?
I mean, it blew up, and it was what progressives and the left and the AOC and all these people were defined by. And part of what happens is that cable news just starts to cover this story way more about climate, the Green New Deal, AOC. And from there, like myself, my boss, Alexander Rojas, Varshini, the ED of Sunrise, Rihanna Gunn-Wright, all of us are just going on TV for the first time in our lives on a regular basis.
This is like early 2019. You're all just getting shipped off to MSNBC studios to defend the Green New Deal.
Here to talk about why that is, Waleed Shahid, who's a former senior staffer to AOC's campaign and a spokesperson for Justice Democrats.
Yeah, and they're like, Mr. Shahid, why are you dividing the Democrats? And I'm like, I just bought this suit at H&M like an hour before I got here. It's $60. They asked me if I needed a private car to take me to Manhattan. I'm like, the subway is a lot faster. Why? I don't know why I got to take this private car. So then, we prepare to talk about the climate crisis. And I'm like, okay, I got to fucking read about what the climate crisis is. I'm like, 350.org. I don't know what that means. Should I figure out what 350 means? How many degrees is the planet warming? I'm like, I got to rewatch the Planet Earth videos to really figure out what they're saying. And then you get on the panel and they're like, all right, we're going live. And then every question they ask on CNN or MSNBC is
The so-called Green New Deal. Why do those three words create such anger from Republicans and even some anxiety among Democrats?
Even House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had concerns.
Republicans aim to make the Green New Deal a key 2020 campaign issue.
You say Democrats are in a way helping Donald Trump.
Green New Deal is going to be a flashpoint.
Did Democrats give Republicans a huge 2020 gift?
The Republicans see it as a key to victory for them, is it?
And I'm like, why did I do all this motherfucking reading? Like,
Yeah, it was amazing how much of that coverage was political. Carlos Maza, a journalist and a YouTuber who was at Vox at a time, made this great video detailing just how much of that G&D coverage was just about
the politics. Is it gonna pass? Does Pelosi like it? What did Trump tweet about it? Everything except, is it a good idea?
yeah, and when I go on TV to talk about the Green New Deal, it's always about, is the party moving too far to the left? Is this something that Donald Trump will use against Democrats in the general election? I never go on TV to discuss what the Green New Deal is actually about. Chris Hayes, I'll give him a shout out, he does the best, but like almost everyone else is pretty trash at this stuff.
but then
And even Chris Hayes will say every time I talk about climate change, my ratings decline. And so if I can do a story, I mean, he doesn't say this part, but if I can do a story about AOC or about young protesters or the party being divided, that actually brings in viewers. And so a lot of the genius of the Sunrise Justice Democrats AOC sit-in basically take the frame in which the media was already likely to cover politics, which was about division, and try to make that division about climate change and sneak in a message about, hey, maybe we should upgrade every building in America to 100% clean energy before it's too late.
Yeah. And now I feel like if the climate movement is successful in setting the agenda going into 2021 and setting the agenda for Biden's first 100 days, it might be because we do that whole thing again.
People forget, but when the sit-in was happening, the reason why reporters were so interested in the sit-in was not just because of, AOC doing the sit-in at Pelosi's office. It was because the speaker's election was about to happen, and people were wondering whether AOC would try to vote against Pelosi, or this new generation of Democrats, the squad, would vote against Pelosi. And so they framed it as a Pelosi versus AOC thing.
Yeah, but in 2018, we knew that Democrats had won back the House, and then the sit-in happened, and that just opened the floodgates of this debate. But right now, we don't know whether or not Democrats will have taken back control of the Senate because we don't know the outcome of Georgia. And I think that uncertainty is kind of holding at bay this fight, this scramble that we're all getting revved up for, that then it's just going to hit in full force in 2021.
Yeah, and it could get really spicy. Are we going to make deals with the Democratic Party establishment? Is the Democratic Party establishment going to make deals with moderate Republicans? And how much appetite is Joe Biden going to have to take on executive orders, especially when there probably will be a battle with the Supreme Court on some of these things?
All important questions that we will have much more definitive answers to after the Georgia Senate runoffs and after we know the balance of power in Congress. And so now we have this precious window of time right now, in the weeks before we are thrown headlong into what might be a historic legislative, administrative trench war to try to get something done on climate in 2021. Before we are negotiating and fighting over the details of climate policy, maybe it would be worth it to reground ourselves in the specifics of the crisis itself. There are a lot of criticisms of the Green New Deal. It's vague, it's not fleshed out, it's too big, it's too fast. But I think one thing that gives the Green New Deal staying power is that it is a genuine attempt to integrate what science is telling us about the speed and scale of the crisis and try to craft a policy solution that could work given how quickly and how totally this crisis threatens to unravel the planet we call home. That's another question. What planet does Joe Biden think he's on? Does he think he's on the planet Earth that he was born on?
Look, man, I gotta be honest. I put some blame on you and your climate people. Because you're like, I'll explain the crisis. And then you're like, we can't let warming go over 1.5 degrees. And most people are like, including myself, no one knows what that means.
It's true. I'm sorry. But look, in my defense, it's very hard to communicate what is going on with the climate crisis, right? Like, what's the big picture? The whole atmosphere of the whole planet has more and more carbon dioxide, so more and more heat is trapped around the whole planet. And that warming is causing millions, billions of disruptions and transformations in climates around the world. Like, there's no way for the human mind to grasp all of that. So we rely on averages. We say, well, on average, the Earth has warmed by 1 degree Celsius since the year 1880, since the Industrial Revolution. And then we make these models of what will happen if the Earth warms on average by 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. But you're right, not very vivid, not like hyenas.
I have some feedback as a normie animal enthusiast. Maybe you should do a better job, like, explaining what it would be like if the planet got to that level of warming.
I agree. And that's why I talked to David Wallace-Wells, a journalist at New York Magazine and the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, because David does the work of reading through literally thousands of climate studies and then synthesizing all of those studies into a picture of what the planet will be like and what the planet is like now and how that's different from perhaps the Earth that Joe Biden thinks he's on. All right. Next, David Wallace-Wells, Waleed. See you later on. David Wallace-Wells, welcome to Bloc Party.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's great to talk to you.
I wanted to talk about the state of the climate crisis with you today. When I was talking to my co-host Waleed earlier, he mentioned that, the climate movement has tried to move away from charismatic megafauna like polar bears, but when Waleed saw a Planet Earth episode about baby hyenas being killed by the crisis, it really struck him. Was there a moment when you began to delve into the science that a particular study or a particular way of conceiving of the crisis drew you in?
Well, it was sort of like, right after the election of Donald Trump, I was in a bleak place, like a lot of people. Also, my dad had just died a few months earlier. And, I'd been following the news from climate science for a while and knew that things were relatively bad. But there was a week, I think it was in early December of that year, when the temperatures in the Arctic were like 40 degrees warmer than they were supposed to be. And I knew enough about climate science then to start to worry that we could be in the midst of a kind of rapid transformation. But it sort of drew me into looking a little harder and thinking a little deeper about just what environmental horrors were in store. And on almost every other point, like when I started reading more scientific papers about agricultural yields or sea level rise or the effect on violence or the effect on economic activity, all of these things, the deeper I looked, the worse it looked. And as a journalist, I looked around and thought, nobody's writing these stories. We pay lip service to how scary climate change is, but we're not actually illustrating what the world would look like if things stayed on the track we're on and we didn't change much. And I found the world that was going to be made inevitable by that status quo really scary, like, keep me up at night kind of scary. And I thought it was a moral obligation that I had to spread the news of that. And as someone who woke up to the scale of the climate crisis through fear in that way, I also thought there was some rhetorical value in scaring people with those futures. One of the things I bring to the subject, it's one of the reasons my writing has been a little different than some others, is that I do come to it with a kind of a stoner wonderment about a lot of these forces, maybe because I'm a little less invested in natural ecosystems or the plight of endangered species or something. And I tend to really think of it in sort of broad historical narratives.
In what you said about the Arctic, that even back in 2016, it reminds me of the parts of your writing where you acknowledge that even the planet we live on today is perhaps different than the planet, let's say, President Joe Biden was born on. Is that true? Would you say that the planet we're all living on today is a different planet than even what it was in 1942 when Joe Biden was just being born on this earth?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's actually a much bigger change than that. The planet now is about 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer on average than it was before the Industrial Revolution. So 1 degree sounds like basically nothing, but it actually puts the Earth outside the entire window of temperatures that enclose the history of human civilization. So it's not just Joe Biden. It's since we invented agriculture 10,000 years ago, the entire rise of human civilization, the development of cities, agricultural revolution, all this stuff, industrial revolution, the rise of culture, the rise of politics, all of that has taken place under climate conditions that we've already totally left behind. We are entirely outside that range of temperatures, which means the planet that we're living on now, in a certain way, I think it makes sense to think of it as like we've landed on a new planet. And it has a different set of climate conditions. And a lot of the civilization that we've brought with us is going to survive under these new conditions, but a lot isn't. And we're going to have to figure out what we need to reform and renovate and rebuild and what we're going to have to totally discard. And what's really scary is not just that everything that we've ever taken for granted as stable as the basis for human civilization has become unstable by these forces, but it's just how fast that is happening. So you mentioned Joe Biden. I actually like to set my clock way later. I'm 37 years old. I'm 38 years old, I guess now. Since I was born, well more than half of all of the carbon emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have been produced. That means that since I was born, we've done more damage to the future climate of the planet than all of the generations that came before me in all of human history. And you can even move it forward. Since 2008, we've had about 20% of all of the carbon emissions that have ever been produced in the history of humanity. So that's not since Joe Biden was born, that's since Joe Biden was sworn in as vice president. And we made a really meaningful difference in the trajectory of the future climate of the planet just in that amount of time. We're changing the carbon composition of the climate now probably about 10 times and maybe as much as 100 times faster as has ever happened in the entire history of the planet. And every time one of these transformations has happened, again, at least 10 times slower than we're doing now, it's been accompanied by what's called a mass extinction, which is when a huge slice of the planet's life dies out. So the most famous one was when the dinosaurs died out. All of the other ones had to do with carbon being produced by climate change. And the scariest one, the end Permian, killed 96% of all life on Earth. And we're now changing the composition of our climate at least 10 times faster than that, which means that even if humans are, and I believe we are an adaptable species, we're going to figure out a way to, a lot of us live on this planet, even if it involves a lot more suffering and a lot more inequality, we're not going to go extinct as a result of it. But we may be living on a planet that is otherwise almost entirely denuded from the natural world that not just Joe Biden grew up with, but you and I grew up with.
Just to be clear, when we look at unprecedented wildfires in California turning the sky orange, that's what climate change looks like right now at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming on average relative to the stable band of temperatures that all of civilization evolved within.
My favorite illustration of that I like to talk about is the experience of Houston, which has been hit by 500-year storms in the last 5 years. So obviously climate change has made that term 500-year storm a little outdated, but I think it helps us to think about what it's supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean a storm that you would expect once every 5 centuries. And 5 centuries ago, no Europeans were living in North America. Hernando Cortez had just landed in Central America. And so we're talking about a storm that you'd expect to hit once during that entire history. The arrival of Europeans in North America, the waging of a genocide against the native people, the building of a colonial state, the fighting of a revolution, the building of a slave empire, the fighting of a civil war, industrialization, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the age of the American empire, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, September 11th, the financial crisis. All of that time, you're talking about a storm that you'd expect to hit once during those 5 centuries, and Houston's been hit by 5 of them in the last 5 years. So we're literally talking about millennia of natural disasters being compressed into a period of just a couple of years.
Just to slow down, since the numbers are so small and the differences in the planet that we all live on and have to survive on are so big, what we're experiencing right now, which is Houston being hit by 5 once-in-a-500-year storm within the course of a decade, that's not like now we're seeing the worst of climate change. That is a now better than best case scenario, because that is an impact of warming that we locked in a few decades ago when you were a kid and we were speeding towards this. What we experience now is better than anything we will experience for the next century, 2 centuries.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the calendar of natural disasters in 2020, and the only sensible way of orienting yourself is to say this is going to be the lightest year of natural disasters we will ever see. In the case of the California fires in particular, I think it's quite scary. The people studying fire science suggest that even if we completely zeroed out on carbon immediately and stopped the warming of the planet in relatively short order, we wouldn't even see those impacts showing up on the dynamics of fire in California until mid-century, until about 2050. And between now and then, we'd probably be seeing something like a 6-fold increase in the amount of acreage burned in that state. Now, just to give a sense, like in 2018, which was a historic fire season, 1.8 million acres burned. Now, that just towered above any other year in the California history books, 1.8 million. And we saw an enormous amount of press coverage. This year, 2020, it's not over yet, and there are still fires burning in California. And we're at more than 4 million acres burned. So we've more than doubled what was once the unthinkably high number of acres burned from just 2 years ago. If you took like the outrage and the horror at what happened in 2018, and you said it's going to be twice as bad in 2020, more than twice as bad, I think you would have expected a lot more coverage and outrage than we've seen.
I've wondered if part of the difficulty with coverage of the crisis not leading to the kind of outrage, fear, alarm that you feel when you delve into the science is that the Paris Accords, not to single them out, but to give an example, really focus our discussion on nations of the world committed to keep warming below 2 degrees. Then we're outraged that Trump takes us out of the Paris Accord. Then Biden gets on stage and says we're going to rejoin the Paris Accord. And in all of this, we are repeating this idea of, well, we were on track when we had committed to stay below 2 degrees. Then we got a little off track with Trump, but now we're going to get back on track. That narrative is in such striking dissonance with we're at 1.2 degrees of warming and wildfires are already doubling in the span of 2 years. What is 2 degrees like then? I mean, what will the planet be like if we get there because we have put off decarbonization so long? Because it seems like in our minds and in the discussion, 2 degrees is relatively okay because it's what we committed to in Paris.
You know, the island nations of the world have called 2 degrees genocide. There was a big UN report that came out in October of 2018 that was just looking at the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. And it's really illuminating. You don't have to get to worst case scenarios of 4 or 5 or 8 degrees of warming to really freak yourself out. 2 degrees is quite scary. And this report found some of its headline findings include the effect of additional air pollution, which could kill 150 million additional people. Again, just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, 150 million people more would die from air pollution. Now, that's 25 holocausts. And that's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Cities in South Asia and the Middle East that are today home to 8 or 10 or even 12 million people would become so hot during summer that at least on some days you couldn't go around outside without risking heat stroke or death, which is one reason why, according to the UN, we could have also as many as 200 million climate refugees. It's an unbelievably large number, which our geopolitics is simply not prepared to respond to in any kind of humane way. And again, this is just at 2 degrees. It sent 1 million Syrian refugees into Europe. So all of the populist backlash to the Syrian refugee crisis that we've seen in Europe over the last decade, all of that was the result of 1 million refugees. And the UN says, on the conservative side, we're talking about 200 times as many. One really important perspective to take in thinking about the climate crisis is that when you go through these impacts, they're not discrete events. If you have a government that needs to be dealing with a drought and a heat wave that's killing people and crop failure, and then there's like a typhoon coming, and there's a migration crisis because of all those things, that government's not going to be able to respond. Even an incredibly well-equipped, well-resourced, and well-run government is not going to be able to respond to each of those crises in the same way that they could have responded to just the first one.
Well, at least the silver lining is that here in the United States, we have a robust liberal democracy that is unlikely to be riven by, any divide and conquer racism that politicians might use as climate refugees flee disasters around the world.
It's hard to really find a truly robust government anywhere in the world that you would say could really be up to the task of managing not just the decarbonization, but the just transition and the migration challenges that are going to come from all these changes.
Yeah, well, I guess these nation states evolved, so to speak, on a different planet. So we don't know how we would have constructed political systems had we been living on such a brutal planet from the start.
Yeah, and the patterns of global injustice are really grossly apparent here. When you think about India and Bangladesh are two countries who are poised to be hit most intensely over the next half century by climate impacts. And I was reading a recent report that said that more than 1 million Indians die every year from air pollution. I think the number was a couple 100,000 infants die before their first birthday just because of air pollution just in India. And they lose something like 8% of their annual GDP because of the effects of air pollution alone. If India and Bangladesh are really going to be, resilient in the face of this change, they're probably going to need a lot of support for the wealthier countries of the world, who are those who are most responsible for the amount of warming that we're likely to see. Among all the other things we need to adjust about our thinking to really address the broad political, social crises that will be brought about by climate change is the reflexive idea that many people, especially in corners of the West, have, that people living elsewhere in the world just matter less.
So we're on a planet that's warmed by 1.1 or 1.2 degrees. As you said, a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions in history that are driving this crisis have been produced since Joe Biden was sworn in as vice president in early 2009. How fast, then, are we careening towards the world at 2 degrees that you just laid out?
The bad news is that the time has basically run out for 1.5 degrees. One way of thinking about this is through what's called the carbon budget, which is just to say, knowing what we know about the climate system, this is how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere and expect to stay around 1.5 degrees. This is the amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere that will allow us to stay below 2 degrees. This is the amount for 3 degrees and so on. And on current emissions levels, we will completely exhaust the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, which again is like the stated goal of not just all of the activists of the world, but also like all of the governments of the world. We will completely exhaust our carbon budget for that in 7 years.
If we keep emitting at the rates we're emitting now, 7 years from now, we'll have emitted enough and the world will warm beyond 1.5.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're likely to be living in quite short order in a world that might even be unrecognizable by the standards of today at 1.2 degrees. The sort of good news is that like the 2 degree budget is actually a lot bigger. We have to get to net zero to stay at 2 degrees by about 2075, 2070. But if we're thinking about global decarbonization as taking place in 7 years, I think there's no way we're going to do that. But if we're thinking about that as taking place over the next 50 years, we can do that. It still requires the wholesale replacement of all of the energy infrastructure in the world and just about every aspect of modern life being rebuilt in some way to prevent carbon from being a part of it. It's a really, really major project. It would be the biggest project ever achieved in the history of humanity. All of these impacts unfold on a spectrum. So it's not like we're going to wake up one day and we're going to be in a 2 degree world, having lived in a 1.5 degree world yesterday. And I think that's actually a really important big picture perspective to keep in mind too, because it means that we should never be complacent with wherever we are, and decarbonizing further will always limit future suffering, even if we get to a pretty bad place. Every little tick that we allowed it to warm is going to make the world worse. So I think the right perspective on how fast we have to move is as fast as we possibly can, as much of us as we possibly can, doing everything that we possibly can in our power at the present moment, while also shifting the boundaries of what's possible for the next generation.
And the other argument against complacency that I think is part of the reason your book made such a splash is, on the one hand, we want to focus our attention on just how different 2 degrees is from 1.5 degrees, just to try to get a sense of how decisive the actions we're going to take in the next decade are. But still then, even in this conversation, I think there can be this assumption that 2 degrees is the upper limit of what's possible, because we've never heard about anything else. And your book makes very clear, and as you just said, that 2 degrees still might be a best case scenario. Even though we have the time to achieve it, it's taking a huge effort to decarbonize rapidly to get there. Can you tell us about the planet beyond 2 degrees?
Well, according to the last major UN IPCC report, they have a scenario, it's called RCP 8.5. And that, for a long time, was referred to as business as usual. I think that's a sort of a misleading term. I think it's much more like a worst case emissions pathway. It builds in an expansion of coal use over this century. But they did a lot of modeling based on that pathway. And they found that if we stayed on that pathway, which we were on for a long time, we would end up, by the end of the century, their median estimate was for about 4 or 4.5 degrees of warming. And at that level, you could see $600 trillion in global climate damages, which is twice all the wealth that exists in the world today. You could see parts of the planet being hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. You could see agricultural yields fall by 50% or more. And you could see warfare more than double. That's at 4.5 degrees, all of that stuff. And that's, technically things could get worse from there if we don't stop pretty rapidly. One of the scariest papers I came across was suggesting that at something like, I think it was 500 parts per million of carbon. And that is, just to give everybody a sense, before the Industrial Revolution, we were at about 280 parts per million. Scientists think that 350, if we stay below that, we'll be pretty stable. We're at about 415 now, at about somewhere north of 500. So not something we would get to this century, but maybe early next century. The planet would entirely lose the ability to form clouds. And that alone could add about 8 degrees of warming, because clouds are a very powerful negative feedback. And that means that we'd probably be at about 5.5 degrees to begin with. And just that effect would bring us to 13 degrees of warming, which does begin to bring the truly uninhabitable planet extinction of the human race into the realm of possibility. I mean, it's really, really hard to imagine anything like a flourishing civilization in that kind of 13-degree zone. Now that's, an extreme high end that would only happen if we follow a path that everybody knows is disastrous now for a very long time without doing much. On the other hand, we've been following a disastrous path that everybody knew was disastrous for a very long time to this point, and we haven't bent our emissions trajectory down as a planet at all. I think there's some reason to think that we are about to make that change, that renewables are much, much cheaper than they've ever been before. But I do think it's worth keeping in mind that in the entire history of renewable energy, we have never used the deployment of green energy to take dirty energy off the grid. We've just used it to expand our energy use. We can't just be satisfied with building out our windmills and our solar panels and transitioning to electric cars and carless cities. We also have to keep it in the ground, keep the oil and coal and gas in the ground, not extract it, because expanding our energy capacity isn't enough. We also need to be sure to get rid of the bad stuff.
I wanted to ask you, you brought up coronavirus. What are you taking away from the experience of the pandemic and what it might tell us about how we can respond to the climate crisis?
Well, the most important thing is that the best way for us at this point to respond to the climate crisis is by responding to the pandemic properly. And by that I mean the governments of the world are right now and will be for the foreseeable future engaged in an unprecedented amount of stimulus spending. It's not just true in the US, it's true all across the world. We don't know how long that'll last, but right now stimulus bills are being written all around the world, and those bills will shape the next decade or two of large-scale infrastructure building everywhere in the world. So because of the pandemic, in a weird way, we have this opportunity to really dramatically rewrite the rules of our world and make climate-targeted investments that will pay off very quickly. And so a lot of what the pandemic means for climate is still TBD. And I don't just mean that in the US, I really do mean that all around the world. In the EU, they've committed to something like 30% of their coronavirus stimulus spending being targeted at climate projects. That's not as much as I would like, but it is actually like miles ahead of any other commitment anywhere else in the world. In a certain way, I think the best path forward for climate activists hoping for a major, major climate push in the Biden presidency is through a coronavirus stimulus bill. But backing up, I take sort of mixed and contradictory messages from our experience with the pandemic. In the spring, we went from never having heard of this disease to essentially locking down the entire northern hemisphere, such that literally more than 1 billion kids were out of school, out of fear and wanting to protect one another and ourselves. We totally stopped in our tracks a system that we thought for a generation was totally unstoppable. And we did it really in the space of like a few weeks. It is a kind of incredible, incredible thing that happened, like unprecedented in global history, that we had such a transformation of human life in such a short amount of time. Patience with that wore thin. It's not just in the US, all across Europe, they've had a lot of resistance to mask wearing and stay-at-home orders a second time around. So I think one real lesson here is just that you can move the public to make dramatic changes, but you need to demonstrate in relatively short order that it's working. And I think that that's a really powerful lesson for climate. The thing that I would say above all that's made me more optimistic in 2020 going into 2021 than I was in 2018 when I finished my book, we've seen, even during the course of the pandemic, a number of major countries and economies commit to very ambitious net zero targets. China's the most important and dramatic one. They want to do it by 2060. I wish it was a little earlier, but for China, that's very ambitious. Much more ambitious than anybody thought they would go for until a few years ago. Japan, South Korea, the EU. If you add Joe Biden's climate commitment to that, you're talking about, I think something like 65% of the global economy and 60% of global emissions that are all now tied up in these net zero pledges. Now, pledges are pledges, who knows? But the most important thing to me about that is that all of them were made independently of any geopolitical pressure. That is, this was not in the context of the Paris Accords. It was not because the US or China was bullying countries to say they were going to decarbonize. It was because totally absent, totally outside of any international framework or any international pressure at all, each of these countries decided that it was in their best interest to move in this direction. And so for a long time, we heard this narrative of like, how can we persuade countries to move when it's not in their self-interest to move? One of the changes that I've been most excited about over the last couple of years is just that economists now really do believe that decarbonization is better for the economy than slow action on climate. And as a result, I think that's one of the reasons why politicians are listening much more to climate activists. And I think what we're seeing now is a sign that just about every country in the world sees it in their own self-interest to move quickly.
Do you think that those new pledges will or should change the politics in the US, where often the counterargument, especially from the right, has become, well, China's the biggest emitter, so how much responsibility do we really have? Do you think the dynamics around that will change?
I think how it plays out in the public is an open question, but I think it's undeniable that what American climate hawks used to say, even when they were disappointed with the Trump administration, that the world would not address climate change without US leadership, I think that has been proven false. Xi Jinping described the US as a climate criminal. That is it's rich, given what China's done over the last couple of decades, but it also signals, the changing landscape of understanding on the world stage.
David, I wonder if you ever if you're ever struck by a more cosmic view of this crisis, when you look out at the night sky, we don't see any other projects of complex, intelligent life. And that part of the crossroads that we're at now is not just politics, not just our societies, but do we get to continue a project of life on a planet like Earth? Or is that too galaxy brain?
You know, the thing I think about most is the fact that when I was born, the planet's climate was stable. And scientists were worried about what would happen, say, over the next century. But by all observations, what was happening then was still what was happening in the climate system a century before or 1,000 years before. And now here we are less than 40 years later, and we are on the brink of climate catastrophe. And that has happened within my lifetime. And as a relatively well-off American, it's happened in large degree in my name. And I'm going to be around, probably a few more decades at least, and that means that I'm also going to be around to watch the critical decades unfold in which we decide what course we're going to take, which means that by the end of my life, I will have seen this incredibly epic story in which the planet went from stability to the brink of catastrophe, and then we did whatever it was that we did to try to secure and stabilize that planet for ourselves and future generations. And that's really scary. I mean, the consequences of inaction are really scary, but it's also amazing to be alive right now and to have the opportunity to stop this crisis. I think if you start to think about how small we are in the universe, it can be pretty discouraging. And there are some theorists, I write about some of them in my book, who suggest that one reason we may not see intelligent life anywhere else in the universe is because at a certain point of intelligence, we just start burning stuff that destroys the habitability of the planet that produced that life. That is a theory. I think it's likelier that we're an accident to begin with, and that this kind of life is very fragile. But still, that fragility is still an argument for real focus on maintaining whatever semblance of the conditions that gave rise to our culture and our people as we can.
David, thank you so much for joining us on Bloc Party.
It's great to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you to David Wallace-Wells for joining us. You can check out his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, and find his reporting in New York Magazine. Waleed, are you feeling okay after that bleak run-through of the future?
Part of me when I was listening to it was, I kind of felt like David is a bit of like a sorcerer. He's like fortune telling about what's going to happen. But I'm like, how do you fucking know what's going to happen when we've never experienced that before?
Yeah, it's a great question. Scientists are building climate models in supercomputers that have like 18,000 pages of code to collect historical data, tree ring data you get out of the ice that you pull out of the Arctic, all of that to try to predict how the Earth changes when it warms, 0.1 degree more on average, 0.2 degrees more on average.
So we are depending on supercomputers to tell us what to do. Robots.
No. Well, I don't think that the science can actually tell us what to do policy-wise. Like, for example, take David saying, net zero by 2070 is an achievable goal that would hopefully, according to the models, keep us below 2 degrees of warming. The science isn't telling us, that's a good goal to set, right? Because also, as David said, 2 degrees of warming is genocide for island nations around the world. It would cause millions more deaths from air pollution, from disasters. So the science is just telling us what might happen if we let it happen. I think policy is where we have to make the decisions. How much do we as a society really want to prevent that level of suffering that we could experience at 2 degrees or more? And how fast are we going to move to transform the economy? That's a question that has to be answered by us
You're talking a lot about the numbers, but if I go on TV tomorrow and I'm like, hey, the climate crisis is basically committing genocide against millions of people around the world, and we're not really doing anything about it, they're going to turn around and be like, okay, so what should we do, Waleed? You want to make everyone ride bikes to work? Okay.
You and millions of other Americans have stared down this crisis and asked themselves, should I ride my bike to work to deal with this? And we can take a page from some establishment Democrats and say, well, let's be serious about this. We have to ask what we can actually do. What institutions even have the power to lead an economy-wide decarbonization? And this is a debate that, as you're saying, we don't even get into. We just dive into the fight, Green New Deal versus this and that, and it's like, let's take a moment and then let's try to assess, do we even have any levers, any power, any institutions with the capabilities to turn this around and decarbonize the economy in time? So to answer that, I talked to Kate Aronoff. She's a co-author of A Planet to Win. She's a longtime climate journalist, a staff writer at The New Republic. Usually, when Kate and I hang out, we talk about the fight in the Democratic Party. But today, I just went through with Kate, brick by brick, who or what has the power to actually deal with this crisis at the scale and speed necessary. Do we as individuals have it? Does the market have it? Does the state have it? And why? Next on Bloc Party, Kate Aronoff. Kate Aronoff, thank you so much for joining us on Bloc Party.
Excited to be here.
How are you doing in quarantine New York?
I'm fine. I don't have COVID, so that's already, starting pretty strong.
And you just finished a book, so maybe not the worst time to be locked in your apartment.
Yeah, no, I would have been a hermit otherwise, because I spent most of this period of the pandemic writing a book. And so it's nice to, have had a period of enforced solitude. And now I have a period of enforced solitude that will not be spent writing a book. So it's a whole new adventure.
Well, we'll be excited to talk about your book when it comes out this spring. I just spoke with David Wallace-Wells, so I'm fresh from remembering all of the terrifying ways our planet could change if it warms 2 degrees or more. I feel like I've internalized this basic point that it just doesn't make sense at this late hour to think about this crisis and solutions at the scale of the individual. Why doesn't that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think to start off, it's a really human response, right? To want to do something that is immediately changing the here and now, so it can feel really empowering to bike to work, because it's a problem that's so abstract, it's so big that it's hard to wrap your head around what capping warming at 2 degrees can look like. We have to electrify the entire economy, but also just there's a massive amount of public investment that we need, right? I mean, people can't go out and build charging infrastructure by themselves for electric vehicles. They can't update the grid to be able to accept electrons as well as to distribute electrons, right? That is nothing that an individual person can do. That's something utilities have to do. That's something that states have to mandate utilities to do. I think it's very understandable the reasons why anyone would want to take sort of personal control over their own contribution to emissions, but it's a very little tiny part of what's actually needed. And we've seen fossil fuel companies, right, sort of feed this lie that it's the individual's fault that the climate is changing. The reason why companies like British Petroleum or Beyond Petroleum, whatever they're calling themselves these days, make up these lines about the carbon footprint being the problem with the climate crisis is to obscure responsibility for who's actually causing this and the kinds of both state dereliction of duty and corporate misdeeds in fueling this problem, that there is just a business model which is incompatible with the future of human civilization that just cannot be profitable, right? Can arguably not exist into the future if we're going to deal with this crisis.
Can you tell us a little bit about how personal carbon footprint became the framework that we understand everything through?
Basically, BP, they come up with this idea of a carbon footprint. And The language they use at some point in the mid-2000s is that you can go on a low-carbon diet. And so the language of this, right, is that this is all of our faults. Maybe BP has more of a responsibility than you do, but if you're not doing your part, then why would we be expected to do our part? Which is totally obscures, the real bare facts of the climate crisis, which is that some 90 corporations are responsible for roughly 2/3 of carbon emissions in the last several decades. And that is not going away. That's just the reality of the situation that we're in, is that there are companies who are destroying the planet and are really trying to keep doing that by any means necessary, and are eager to shift that blame off to anyone else that they can, to do anything they can to keep their social license to operate a business model which cannot continue. There's a pretty clear logic behind why they might want to do that, and why, you see on the social media pages of basically every major fossil fuel company, how can you bring down your own carbon footprint? How are you, responsibly going home for the holidays or something like that? And it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. These companies should not exist. Their business model should not exist. Could not be more clear just from looking at a really barefaced account of what's happening.
Okay, so we as individuals are not responsible for driving this crisis forward, and we don't wield the power to transform the economy on our own. So let's move to an entity that does bear some responsibility and does have the power to change things. The United States, specifically as a nation on the world stage. Because if we're setting these global targets, we are aiming for the entire world to get to net zero emissions by 2050 to give us a chance of keeping warming at or below 1.5 degrees, which some people now say is wildly ambitious. What can the United States do, and what does the United States have a responsibility to do to make that kind of transition possible globally?
So even 2 degrees is a hugely ambitious goal, and 1.5 degrees is even more ambitious than that. And so to decarbonize the global economy, and that looks different in some places. That should happen the quickest in countries like the United States, who have taken or stolen an enormous amount of wealth and been able to build economies that are very wealthy and are able to transition quickly, right? More quickly than most other places on Earth, and have an outsized responsibility for this crisis, an outsized share of what's called the historical responsibility for the climate crisis. Some new numbers came out finding that the US should actually, if it's taking full account of its responsibility, bring down its emissions by 195% by 2030, right? And so what does that mean? What does it actually mean to bring down your emissions by 195%? So they say that should bring domestic emissions down by 70% by 2035, and then make emissions reductions possible for other countries who do not have the resources to do that.
And just to make sure we're getting that right, to keep the world at or below 1.5 degrees, the U.S. needs to ramp down its emissions by 195% within the next decade.
Yeah, and part of this, I would just add, is a matter of diplomacy, right? It's not just a matter of carbon accounting. It's the fact that the U.S. reliably shows up in spaces like the United Nations Framework on Climate Change and yells at other countries for not bringing down their emissions fast enough, while bringing basically nothing to the table, right? By bringing no binding commitments to the table, to fight to take binding commitments off the table, and also to kneecap any conversation about historical responsibility as it translates into real dollar commitments.
And this is why so many advocates in the climate movement are not at all encouraged by rejoining the Paris Accord being the center of Joe Biden's pitch, when it has been the center of Joe Biden's pitch, because that accord does not bring binding commitments.
Exactly, yeah. So rejoining the Paris Agreement has been about the only thing that most Democrats can agree that we should do on climate change, right? Everyone on the Democratic debate stage said it back in the primaries. It's pretty uncontroversial. There's very little detail provided as to what that actually means. So if we rejoin the Paris Agreement, we need to come with a commitment that's much stronger than it was when we left. Because of the way the agreement is written, we need to ratchet up every couple of years. But we know that the Paris Agreement also doesn't have teeth, right? For historical reasons that I won't get into right now, the UN has very little enforcement power. And where the US actually does have a tremendous amount of power is in spaces like the Bretton Woods institutions, where we have effective veto power over bodies like the IMF and World Bank, which do control real financing, and trade agreements, right? We negotiated a tremendous amount of trade agreements which protect corporations' ability to sue sovereign governments in some cases, these investor-state dispute settlements, which if a country passes, a climate law that's too strong, they can be sued by corporations and are over energy matters most frequently. And so there are all of these other tools which exist outside of the confines of the Paris Agreement that the US does have a tremendous amount of sway over by virtue of 300 years of colonialism. Taking the climate crisis seriously means using every tool available to the United States to really take that on, and that includes things that are not under the auspices of the UNFCCC.
So we can talk about all the tools that we have to, in a humane, in a democratic way, shoot for that year after year reduction in emissions. I can imagine if Democrats fail to do a real trajectory-changing climate policy through the stimulus or through another bill in 2021, that the most optimistic take might be, well, there can always be, a breakthrough technology, market forces can move quickly, and hopefully we can hold out hope for some kind of breakthrough moment. And I think from reading your reporting, it feels like that hope is no longer grounded in how markets around energy have actually worked. Do you think that given what the UN is telling us, if we took that seriously, we would take off the table this hope that we may have had these past decades that a breakthrough technology and market forces are going to save us?
It's a very good question. So often climate change gets talked about, like you're alluding to, as a market failure, right? And so what that means is the market is being fed bad information. And so the cost of carbon dioxide, the cost of pollution is not being properly accounted for in prices, which is most of the information that a market has to work with. And so if we were to adjust that cost to reflect the true cost of pollution, right, usually through some kind of carbon pricing or a carbon tax, that would correct this bad information that is being fed to the market. And so that assumes a lot of things, right, about what markets are for. It assumes that the ultimate outcome, that markets, which are made by states, which are socially constructed things, that sort of amorphous thing is driving toward a goal which is in the ultimate best interest of humanity. And we know that's not the case, right? We know that there are plenty of things which are very profitable and which markets have no incentive to change, right? The enormous amount of unpaid labor that women do is very profitable and just objectively not in the best interest of humanity. 50% of which roughly is women. And so there are things that are very profitable which don't align with the interest of humanity, and fixing the sort of market failure as if a perfectly well-functioning market is going to drive us toward fixing the climate crisis is a fantasy, right? We know that states create markets, states shape markets in all sorts of ways. And so as someone who thinks that breakthrough technology is absolutely necessary to deal with the climate crisis, that we really do need technological breakthroughs, the history of technology and technological development just does not say that markets deliver that. There's always, whether it's the internet or cell phones or the rapid decline in the price of solar panels in the last decade, the way markets work is when states work actively to shape them, that don't turn a profit, and that there's a risk on it. And often it is the government that takes that risk for humanity. We can see it in the vaccine trials, right? The government committed to buying an enormous amount of vaccines, both here in the US, governments abroad committed to this, and pharmaceutical companies regularly get subsidies, regularly benefit from public research funding, and they get to hoard all the profits. And that's not how things should work. And so it's not that But I think markets are sort of important drivers of activities that happen, but it's worth being clear about what markets are, which are creations of state policy, and really thinking strategically about the places where state policy can shape markets and can push it toward a direction, and which things just shouldn't be subject to market forces, right? Things like healthcare, basic needs, should not be contingent upon whether someone can make a profit off of them. And I think a lot of the language around climate change as a market failure ignores that and ignores the really central role that states play in creating markets.
And the story about the capacity of solar cells and solar panels ramping up while their price goes down, I think is often cited as a market-driven story. So it's striking to hear you reframe it and say we should understand that advancement as part of the ways that states are already structuring markets to begin this transition. And then we need to think about the levers that we have beyond that.
Yeah, and I'll say, I am borrowing most of this from an economist named Mariana Mazzucato, but, we can look to just a decade ago. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act devoted a relatively small portion of what was already a too small stimulus to green technology in ways that I think were in some ways very problematic.
This is the Obama 09 stimulus, just to be clear.
Yeah, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act devoted about $90 billion toward the green economy. That invested most famously in a company called Solyndra, which was a solar company that went under. But the story that's not often told, and that Mariana Mazzucato and others have told, is that the program that Solyndra benefited from, this loan guarantee program, ended up turning a profit that is in many ways more profitable than the average venture capital firm. And so government investment really went a long way for making companies like Tesla, as much as Elon Musk likes to talk about himself as this sort of capitalist like entrepreneur who, by his sheer genius, has made electric cars work, has benefited from an enormous amount of state investment. And so that's the story of why solar panels have gotten so much cheaper, which is a great thing for humanity in the last 10 years, is that the state invested in it. And I think the lesson of that is that there are a lot of things that were wrong with the stimulus. A, that it was way too small. B, that it really didn't talk about the sort of benefits that it was bringing about. But even that very small amount of money, $90 billion is a drop in the bucket for the American economy, had huge results, right? We're still seeing the gains of that today. And so think of what can happen if we invest $2 trillion, as Joe Biden has said he would like to, or $16 trillion, as Bernie Sanders proposed in the primary. It's orders of magnitude greater than the gains we saw after the recession last time and the stimulus.
So putting aside the squabbles in DC, let's just focus on what the government actually has the capacity to do before we get to talking about what's possible. What are the levers of power that the federal government has that policymakers should be looking to much more closely as we create a plan for this pivotal decade that will decide whether we stay as close to 1.5 degrees as possible? What are the key levers that you think need to be part of this decade of policymaking?
Sure. The United States government can do almost anything, right? There is no shortage of money available. We are the source of the world's reserve currency. We can't go bankrupt. We can spend as much money as we want, doing basically anything we want. And the government can learn new tricks. In the mobilization leading up to World War II, the US government created whole supply chains from scratch for stuff like synthetic rubber that we didn't really know how to produce at any sort of scale. But we did it. We just threw money at it, and we did it. And we can do that again for green energy. I think there's a lot of cynicism about what's possible for the government to do after 40 years of neoliberalism, but there's really no ceiling on what we can do. Think about, just the New Deal, right? Put hundreds of thousands of people to work before computers, built an enormous amount of infrastructure, bridges, roads, just did an enormous amount of stuff that the US had never, ever done before, constructed a welfare state almost from scratch, not totally, but almost from scratch, very, very quickly, within a matter of months, without computers. I mean, we have, some of the fastest computers in the world. My cell phone is more powerful than the computer that sent people to the moon, right? there's nothing we can't do if we put our mind to it. And the idea that the climate crisis is this thing that we just can't solve, that is this unknowable, unwieldy thing, is insane. I think the bigger problem, obviously, is a political one. And so in order to make these sorts of changes, we need sustained Democratic majorities. And in the US, big D Democratic majorities for a long time. And so the changes that we make on the road toward a low carbon future, there has to be a clear benefit for ordinary people, right? This is what the New Deal did. It made people's lives better. It had projects in every county, in every part of the country, and made that clear, right? We can talk about the many, many problems with the New Deal. It excluded women and people of color from many of its programs. But the basic bargain that New Deal administrators had was that this would build the New Deal coalition. This would make the case for why people should vote for Democrats by improving their lives, by delivering the country out from a Great Depression. And it did that. It built new constituencies. It brought new people into the Democratic Party by making clear how Democratic rule was making their lives better. And Democrats maintained majorities for decades after that. And so that is the task. And so I think if we're thinking in that realm, how do we build a coalition for a Green New Deal? How do we build the sorts of electoral majorities that we know will be needed for the scale of government action that's necessary? I think we need to be talking about things like a federal job guarantee. The government has employed people directly before. Public sector jobs are not new. We can be building out new national parks. We can be remediating coastlines. There's all of this work that is just not profitable for the private sector to do. And we have a lot of people out of work. And so a federal job guarantee can make obvious why you will benefit from a Green New Deal and why you will benefit from continued Democratic Party majorities in Congress and having a Democrat in the White House. Policy is to make people's lives better. You just need to give people stuff in order to win Democratic majorities. And often, thankfully, giving people stuff overlaps with what we need to do to decarbonize the economy. You know, a 4-day work week is a preferable alternative to a 5-day work week, and certainly to a 7-day work week for people who were stretched between 3 jobs to put food on the table for their kids. So what we have now is not so worth clinging on to, I would argue, for a lot of people. And we should think seriously about how the world we build can be both a greener one, but also a more pleasant, a more fun one, right? I want more time to, hang out in parks with my friends and just have more time to go to the beach, have public transit that will get me to the beach. But those visions for a better life are being foreclosed right now by business as usual and by a commitment to keeping capitalism going as it has been for the last 50 years. So we can build something better. And it just so happens that that better life aligns with a greener life.
A better life aligns with a greener life because taking Friday off every week and taking a nap in the park is a very low carbon activity, is what I hear you saying. Kate, thank you so much for joining us. Kate, your book, Overheated, is coming out in April, is that right?
420.
All right.
Speaking of the greener life.
Speaking of the greener life, folks, mark 420 in your calendar, 2021. Kate, thank you again. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Kate Aronoff, co-author of A Planet to Win, staff writer at The New Republic, and author of the forthcoming book, Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, coming out on 4/20/2021.
Kate, what are you doing that day? Kate? Oh, it's Earth Day. It's Earth Day. Sorry. I didn't mean to imply anything.
Yeah. Waleed, that was today's episode. Are you feeling grounded in the stakes of the crisis, in the scale and the speed?
Yes, but I'm mostly just feeling how absurd the past 2 years of my life have been, given what David and Kate have to say about the urgency of the climate crisis. I mean, it is so dumb that in the United States, in order to make climate change a priority, in order to make a response to anything that David and Kate are saying adequate, you have to defeat a Wall Street Democrat by electing a bartender to Congress, create a social movement that will organize a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, get that member of Congress to appear at the sit-in, and then make sure that the news media covers it. And even then, when they cover it, it's only about Dems in disarray. You know, lots of people were like, why don't you just meet with Nancy Pelosi and talk to her about the IPCC report? Man, that's not how change happens in this country. I would love to have met with Nancy Pelosi and just told her that the Green New Deal was the right thing to do. I don't think that would have worked, folks. You know, I was in the UK during the sit-in at a Labour Party conference, and they were like, this would never happen in our country. A new backbencher like AOC doing a sit-in at the Labour Party leader's office, unheard of, would never happen, counterproductive. And I was like, yeah, that sort of stuff doesn't happen in the US. I don't think it's ever happened before. And, you know, I asked them, you know, if there was a policy or a bill that a backbencher or someone in the Labour Party wanted to introduce and get the Labour Party to adopt, how would they do it? And they said, we have a convention, a conference every year. And at that conference, you can organize a majority of the delegates to support a certain policy. And then that policy then gets adopted by the Labour Party as a whole. And that is not how politics works in the US. The DNC, that's not how it functions. You can't really put forward a policy and then just organize delegates at the DNC to support it. Basically, what I've learned is that, like, in the US, there is no mechanism to officially change the party's position. There's only this inside-outside strategy to try to do what is very simple in many other countries. And so, 2 years later, we have a pretty ambitious climate plan from Joe Biden, and now we have to push him to actually enact it.
Well, Waleed, I think the system is working just as the founders intended. First, the United Nations and the world's best scientists have to put out a report saying there'll be mass food shortages and mass die-offs of coral reefs within the next few decades. And then a bunch of kids need to find a way to make that scientific report relevant to a cable news segment about Nancy Pelosi. Will she be reelected speaker?
Yeah, pretty cool system we have here, folks. Seems very democratic and responsive to the crises that people are facing.
Well, one day, Waleed, all this organizing will pay off, and you'll get to go into the room where it happens, where the people who make the news decide what's on the nation's agenda, and you'll get to tell them what you think.
Oh, I've already been there. You know, after the resolution came out, we organized a briefing for one of the most important editorial boards in this country, who shall not be named. And we did a 30-minute presentation about the IPCC report, you know, a lot of the stuff that Kate and David talked about, why we need to upgrade every building, home, and mode of transportation to 100% clean energy, or we might die. And after all of that information was delivered to the most powerful opinion makers in America, one of the leading editors said, the first question they asked was, so are you guys going to support the Democratic nominee for president against Donald Trump? And I just wanted to flip the table over, because what an absurd, ridiculous question to ask, given the presentation we just gave. As if there was no interest in the science or the policy or the governance strategy. Many people in the Democratic Party establishment and the media establishment want to criticize AOC and Sunrise and Justice Democrats for dividing the Democratic Party. But you really just have to hate the game. We're just all players in this dumbass game that we're playing in order to get our voices heard. And if there are better ways to get our voices heard, I would pursue those strategies. But because the media thrives on controversy in this country, sometimes you have to give them a little controversy in order to save the planet.
Well, I think, unfortunately for you, Waleed, 2021 may contain more trying to shoehorn a basic understanding of the climate crisis into cable news segments about Nancy Pelosi's speakership and who's mad at who in Congress. But before we get there, I hope this episode provided some respite from that politics and gave you and folks listening some time to reground in why why we're still banging our heads against the U.S. political system because of what's at stake. All right, that's the show. You can email us about the Green New Deal, questions, topics, tirades at blockpartypod@gmail.com. Becca Rose is our producer. Leslie Gaston Bird is our mix engineer. This week, a special guest producer helping record interviews and cut tape, Jeremy Flood, the same guy who's been DJing the party the whole time. And special thanks, as always, to Amy Westervelt and Michael Catano.
Save the whales.
See you on the block.
Bye.